Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to another episode, session, edition. We need to figure out which word we're using to define what we do each month here. It's not quite a podcast yet, but coming soon, this may become a podcast. So stay tuned for those updates. So welcome to Hummingbird Hour. We are just letting our guests into the room. So I'm going to give it just one more minute and then we will officially get started. So hang tight as we let everyone into the room, and Zoom catches up with all those who've joined. And there's always that 1 minute delay. I feel like I get the email notification that people are in my Zoom room, and then I'm like, but they're not there. I can't let them in yet. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Happy Tuesday again, everyone. Welcome to Hummingbird Hour. Hummingbird Hour is our monthly conversation series where we invite thought leaders and change makers to join us for a conversation about the wonderful work that they're doing to make a difference in the world. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Vanessa and JR Ford, and we'll do more formal introductions of both of them in just a moment. Before I dive in though to our official welcome, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the tragic events of the weekend and the deaths and the murders that transpired in Buffalo. I know that many of us are processing what transpired and thinking about how are we part of the change that needs to happen? How do we continue to combat the systems of oppression and the reality of racism in our country, and how racism is continuing to kill people, and that people are losing their lives because of the pandemic of racism. So I want to just say that we're reflecting at Hummingbird about what we can do and how do we respond and how can we be part of that change. And my thoughts and my heart is with all of those impacted, and also just with the Black community that continues to wake up to these tragic events. And I also know that thoughts and prayers aren't enough. And please know that Hummingbird and I are committed to taking action and continuing to be part of the change. And hopefully we can make the world a better place and a safer place for everyone. So I just want to ask us to all pause for a moment and just take a moment of silence, and then we'll return to the events of the day. Okay. Thank you all for joining with me in that moment of silence. And again, for those impacted in Buffalo and around the globe, please know that we're thinking of you. Okay, we're going to return back to Hummingbird Hour. I have to sort of navigate between emotional moments and exciting moments because I think this is an important conversation today that we're going to have, and I want to honor some of the other conversations that are part of May. So let's dive into our official welcome to Hummingbird Hour. So first, I'm excited to share that Hummingbird Humanity, that we're continuing to grow. Hummingbird turns 2 this month. I still can't believe it's been 2 years since I launched Hummingbird Humanity with our live conversation series, Hope, Heart, and the Human Spirit, in May of 2020. And of course, indicative of the events of this past weekend, the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago has catapulted conversations around racism and systemic oppression to the national and global spotlight. Conversations that have been in play for many, many years, but many of us paid attention in a different way. And I'm really grateful that Hummingbird has been part of the work to make workplaces better, workplaces more inclusive and diverse and equitable, and workplaces where humans can thrive. So we are just happy that we're still here and making a difference in the world. And thank you for all being part of the Hummingbird Humanity community. So for those of you joining us today, I would certainly welcome and invite you to share in the chat where you're where you're joining us from. Share your LinkedIn if you want to connect with others that are joining us today. This is, as part of the Hummingbird community, we all want to celebrate and amplify and elevate each other. So please share about yourselves in the chat and connect with each other. We've also enabled live captions for anyone who may be deaf or hard of hearing, or who prefers to use captions. So click on the caption button in your Zoom bar, your Zoom toolbar, if you'd like to see the captions today. I also want to just acknowledge that there are several months, awareness, heritage months that we're celebrating this month as well. So we have Mental Health Awareness Month. And certainly, as many of you will know, I talk about my experiences with mental illness and how my journey on mental health has been so important to me. And I know that's true for so many of you as well. So we want to make sure we honor Mental Health Awareness Month. It's also Jewish American Heritage Month. And Asian. It looks like my script and our slides are in a different order. Mark and Lindsay will chat about that later. No, it's all good. So it's Jewish American Heritage Month, and it's also Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So I know that many of you and many of your organizations are celebrating these different communities and working to share stories and help us understand and build greater awareness and understanding of each other's lived experiences. Today, in the spirit of our conversation, which I think was what I would love to say it was intentional and it just happened this way. It's also the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, which I think is, it certainly is a nice moment for us to be having a conversation today around transgender youth and the challenges that our transgender youth are facing across our country. So we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Next week, we have our Hummingbird Hour special edition, Amplifying Transgender, Non-Binary, and Gender Non-Conforming Voices. So I'm delighted that we have a wonderful panel of guests joining together, all members of the trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming community, to share about their experiences, their perspectives, and help us understand the community as well, and answer some of the questions that many of you may have to understand different lived experiences than your own. So please join us next week as well. And then next month, I believe is the next slide, we have Rhodes Perry, who will be joining us on June 21st for next month's Hummingbird Hour. And Rhodes is a two-time author and also an openly transgender man. So we'll continue our conversation for Pride Month and learn from Rhodes about how do we create cultures of belonging in our workplaces. Today, though, we have Vanessa and JR Ford. Vanessa and JR are nationally known advocates for LGBTQ+ rights and specifically transgender youth. Their advocacy and work has been featured in the New York Times, Newsweek, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and in Gender Revolution, A Journey with Katie Couric. I'm a big Katie Couric fan, so I'm a little jealous. In addition, they are members of the human rights campaigns Parents for Transgender Equality Council and authors of the children's book Calvin. They live with their two children, one of whom is transgender, in the Boston, Massachusetts area. Vanessa and JR, I'm so delighted that you're with us today. Thank you so much again for saying yes.
Of course, we love saying yes to things like this. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here with all.
Yeah, I'm Vanessa Ford. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm JR, and my pronouns are he, him.
And as Brian mentioned, we are two parents. I was also an educator in DC public schools for about 15 years. And we are the authors of Calvin. And, you know, it's a little unusual when you're an adult and you come to a conversation to open with a children's book, but let's all put on our children's hat for a few moments, sit back, relax, and we'd love to share Calvin's story with you as the impetus for a conversation after.
Let's not think about work right
No.
now.
All right.
We'll take a break from work, and while Vanessa and JR are bringing up this book, I will share with the audience. As Vanessa and JR already know, I wanted to read the book, of course, before our live conversation today, and I read it about an hour ago. And fortunately, I have wiped away the tears. So if you're not ready for the tears to flow, make sure you get your tissues, because this is a really, really beautiful story.
And we'll just note, thank you so much, Brian, that Calvin was inspired by our child's journey. And we will get into more of that when we are done. So please enjoy Calvin. We also wanted to note that we have this really large dedication. This book has been dedicated to each and every one of our trans child's teachers that they've had since they transitioned at 4, along with some amazing trans activists and friends of ours. So let us begin.
For as long as I could remember, I knew I was a boy.
I draw myself with short hair and a shirt like Papa's. I dream about swim trunks like my dad and brother wore. I didn't tell my family until the night before our summer trip to Gigi and Papa's. I was scared they wouldn't believe me, but I knew it was time to be me. Whenever I have to do something scary, my dad always says, take deep breaths and count down from 5.
Everyone ready? Breathe in, breathe out. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm not a girl, I told my family. I'm a boy in my heart and in my brain.
We love you if you are a girl, boy, neither, or both. We love you whoever you are, my dad said. Later, Dad told me the word for how I felt was transgender. Being transgender means other people think you are one gender, but inside, you know you're a different one. I wondered how Gigi and Papa would react. As we got closer, I squeezed my stuffed lion to my chest. I had already told my family who I was. Now I needed to tell them my name. The same name as your favorite stuffed lion, Dad asked. It's why I named him that. It's always been my name to me.
When we got to Gigi and Papa's, Dad told them my new name. He introduced me. Our summer trip turned out to be the best ever. At the comic convention, Papa bought me my favorite costume. My favorite superhero signed my poster using my real name.
At Waterworld, Gigi bought me and my brother matching swim trunks. Even the water slides felt better in them. In line for popcorn, I made a new friend. I felt proud to tell him my name. We spent the whole day together.
On the last day of vacation, at the big outlet stores near Gigi and Papa's, I picked out new clothes. That night, I gave my family a fashion show. You look so handsome, Gigi told me. School was starting soon, and I knew there was only one more thing I needed to feel like me. When I looked in the mirror, I finally saw me.
Dad said there were other transgender people in the world, but I didn't know any kids like me at my school, and school started next week. Being the only one felt scary. How would everyone treat me? What if my friends wouldn't call me he? What if, what if, what if?
The first day of school, I dragged my feet to the door. Breathe in, breathe out. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to school. We're glad you're here. When the principal said my name, I felt safe and happy. Violet skipped up to me, calling out my new name too. Do you know my name? I asked. Yep. Your dad told my mom you're a boy now. I've always been a boy inside. Are we still friends? Yes. Did you bring your jump rope for recess?
When I stepped inside my classroom, I couldn't believe what I saw. The cubby, the lunch chart, the homework station, and the mailboxes, the name tag on the table. My new name was everywhere. Everywhere it should be.
I felt my fears start to go away. Welcome back to class. For morning meeting, we'll all share about our summer stories, or we'll all share about our summers. I knew just what I would say when it was my turn.
I stood up proudly to share my summer story, but first I introduced myself. Hi, I said, my name is Calvin, Calvin, and I felt my what ifs melt away. The end. Now the end.
Such a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing the story with us, and again for being with us today. So one of the conversations that we have at Hummingbird is that we believe that diversity conversations are for kids too. And I work with so many adults that are parents like yourselves that are in workplaces and in DEI trainings that we're doing, and they're like, where do I find these resources, and how do I talk about these conversations with my kids? I don't know if that was the inspiration for you to write this book, or if it was just your own personal story, or a little bit of both, but how did you get here? How did you end up with a book about
you have like 20 hours. How did we get here? It all started.
Very easy.
So as we mentioned, we have a transgender child. Our child currently uses they, them pronouns and identifies as transgender non-binary. However, in 2015, our child told us very clearly, much like Calvin did, I'm a girl in my heart and my brain. It was actually their 4th birthday. We had a house full of people for a housewarming, I think, and their birthday party. And at the time we thought we had a son, but we also were a pretty open family. And so we thought we had a son, and he was, and they were wearing a dress, Elsa dress from Frozen and Lightning McQueen slippers. And so we were going up to bed on this birthday. I think it was March 21st, 2015. And I said, well, Facebook memories tells me what day it was. I said, you are my favorite princess boy. And my child turned to me, looked me straight in the eyes and said, I'm not a boy. I'm a girl in my heart and my brain. To which I said, let's go brush our teeth and go to bed. Like, what a great day. What do we do with this information? Yeah. So we started looking for resources, and we lived in Washington, D.C. at the time, and had some connections with the Human Rights Campaign, and ended up talking with a number of trans leaders at the National Center for Transgender Equality, Human Rights Campaign, and getting connected to other families with little kids who were saying similar things. And what we found, it took us a few months, but what we found is that we actually had a daughter at the time that we didn't know. And in June, it was July of 2015, our child Ellie chose their name, named after a lovey, just like Calvin. They have an elephant lovey, and they chose their name. We started using she, her pronouns as sister. And then about 2 years ago, during COVID, Ellie came to us and said, you know, she's not fitting quite right either. I feel like I'm neither or both and still figuring it out, but I know I'm transgender, non-binary, and they, them pronouns fits me better. And we said, great. And we've been on that journey since. Now, very quickly, because I'm not very quick, we're looking for resources, and there were no books that represented families like ours. So we had I Am Jazz, which is a classic book. Jazz is a white woman now, but there were no other books with children of color, trans children of color, and there were no books in 2018 when we started writing this book with transgender boys. So we knew we didn't want to write a book just called Ellie and telling our child's entire story. So we actually interviewed lots of trans kids, including our own, to come up with this amalgamation of Calvin. And we got the name from a real transgender boy in Canada. And wanted to depict a supported, no bullying, 100% affirmed transgender child of color at school and at home.
Yeah, and we've heard, you know, people talk about, you know, it seems like a fairy tale, and, you know, this isn't real. Well, it absolutely is real. You know, it's a part of our journey, and it represents a lot of people's, a lot of kids' journeys, you know, and being supported by family, by friends, by the school, and by the community.
Yeah.
I have so many questions, and as we promised before we went live, I'm going to go off script because I have some great questions here. So I'm just going to go where I'm inspired to go. So I'm going to make an assumption that you have been fortunate enough to help other parents and other families going through this conversation. What are some of the first, and I'll just start for myself. Like when, I am in my mid 40s, and I am from a generation that was advocating for inclusion for gay individuals like me, and certainly there's generations before me that fought, that allowed me to be the person I am today. And when I started to learn more about transgender identities or non-binary identities or gender non-conforming identities, I'm all for it. Like, everyone be yourselves. I'm great here, but it was also confusing for me at times. And so I've been fortunate to have people who've helped me on that journey. So I'm curious, what are the questions you get, and what are the first things you offer for people who are like, I want to be supportive, but I don't even know what I don't know.
Right.
It's a great question.
It's a great question. I would say one of the biggest things that we got when Ellie first transitioned, and we're talking about, Brian, a social transition right now. And what that means is name, pronoun, and the way that you dress and present to the world. No medical intervention. We're talking about young children here. People would say, is this a phase? Right? This has got to be a phase. And I had a therapist early on when I said something similar. And she told me people are who they say they are until they tell you otherwise. And I often tell people it's not our responsibility to understand the complexities of gender. It's our responsibility to respect who people say they are. So yes, one might struggle with using they, them pronouns, but it's our responsibility to try and to practice. We often tell parents of non-binary children who say, I'm just really struggling with the singular they, to practice it. We've had some who've put swear jars in their houses where when they mess up, they put $1 in it, and then it goes to, something that the child and the parent does together. So the phase is a big question. We get that for young children, but then teenage children who come out, they often will ask, oh, are they just confused? Adults who come out say, they find another reason to kind of disavow people's identity. But again, people are who they say they are until they tell you otherwise.
Yeah, and I would add, I just thought of a new little phrase, but
TM.
Accept and respect. When you meet someone new, whether they're trans or non-binary, accepting them for who they are and respecting them is, I think, one of the first steps about, supporting them. But also, for us, it was about educating ourselves. We have the internet available to us now. It is all around us. It's at our fingertips. The first thing that we really tried to do was do some research. That was
so much research.
That was one of the things that, Vanessa is our researcher in residence here. So that was one of the key things, was doing their homework. Even if you don't understand some of the terminology, there are resources out there, such as the Human Rights Campaign, the National Center for Transgender Equality, that has resources out there at a 101 level to help educate, the common, person.
What do you think is the most, I'm going to say the most, but my guess is there's a list of these, of the most common misperceptions or misunderstandings as people are trying to understand what the stories you're telling them and the experiences of Ellie or of Calvin?
I think one of the misconceptions is that parents and ideology and beliefs are forcing children to transition. And that this is, there is a new thing that is in the anti-trans world called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And it's not real. It's not an actual diagnosis or scientific thing, but this idea that this is a trend, that children are transitioning all over the place and they're accessing medical care very quickly. Doctors are pushing it, families are pushing it, when in reality, it's not easy. It's not easy for most people in the country to access the medical care that they need to support their transitions. It's not necessarily covered by all insurances. It's against the law in a number of states, which we'll get to. But I think this perception that this is increasing because of ideologies and easy access to care is not correct. What we've seen in the parent community, and we're part of parent communities with over 10,000 families from around the country and world with all kinds of trans identified children, is that parents and school communities are working to be more accepting. And because they're more accepting, children are more likely to come out when they're younger because they're in environments that can support it. Of course, what we're seeing nationally are legislative attacks to try to quell that in really dangerous ways.
Yeah, I appreciate, well, I want to highlight a couple of the things that have struck me just in our conversation so far. So I really appreciate the accept who someone says they are until they tell you something different. Like that's, I think, is a really beautiful message. And I think about the journey that each of us, regardless of our gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation, which is not really part of today's conversation, like that's a journey for each of us. And I remember when I first started coming out, I as a gay man, I thought that I needed to be effeminate in my expression because those were the handful of images I saw. And I happened to find this wonderful group of gay individuals, and all of them happened to do drag, which is also a different conversation than the one we're having today. That's a performance art. And they were like, Brian, that's just not you. Just stop trying to be, because I was like, what's my word that I'm going to use? Because, they would use whatever, I don't remember the words. And I'm like, I'm going to call everyone beautiful. And they're like, stop, that's just not you. And I was trying to be something that I'm not. And so that it is a journey for each of us. And but I love, like, they just said, like, you don't have to be anything but just who you are. And they accepted me for me. And my journey was fairly easy. I was fortunate to be born into a body where I identify with that gender identity, but that's not true for everyone. And how do we accept them on that journey? And the world is not built for them. So healthcare systems and resources, all of those things.
Yep. Yeah. Healthcare, schools, churches, community organizations, universities, they're not built physically. We're talking, gender neutral bathroom access, for example. They're not built for non-binary folks or transgender folks, but they're getting there and they're learning. And there are great people doing great work in so many of these spaces to become more affirming. And what you just said, interestingly, about trying to be something specific, when Ellie first transitioned, they were really girly, right? Like really just trying to show the world, I am very binary in this space. Yep. And over the years, that shifted some as they became more comfortable and had more knowledge at 11. They're now 11 and a half almost, about what is available to them, what language is there and what ways can they present to the world. And they found their space.
Yeah, and it's a journey for each of us. And so I think that message of accept people who are as they say they are until they tell you otherwise is so important. And it is a lifelong journey to understand ourselves, regardless of our identities. I think that's a journey we all go on. You started to talk about the legislation that's sweeping the country and is just terrifying in many ways, I would say, for me. And much of that legislation is targeting the transgender community. Would you like to talk about how that's what's sort of your perspective on that legislation and how that's impacting you and people that you know and love and maybe even your family?
Yeah. 337. That's how many anti-LGBTQ bills are currently this legislative session being heard in states across the country. Huge swath of states, 20 or so states. 150 of them are anti-trans. Another subset are specific to education. Almost all of them target youth. We're talking kids before, and some are even extending it up to like 19 or 21. Alabama passed a law last week that made it a felony for doctors to provide affirming, and I would say life-saving care to trans individuals up to age 19. Luckily, that has been blocked in court. So that is a very good thing. But we have friends in Texas where the governor came out with a letter that said teachers, counselors, community people basically turn trans kids into child protective services so their families can be investigated. We have family friends who are being investigated by child protective services for affirming their transgender children in Texas currently. Does that impact us in Massachusetts? No. Could it impact where our child wants to travel, where they want to live their life? Yes. Does it impact our community that we're part of? Absolutely. We don't let Ellie know a lot of the different things that are going on because, they're focusing on finishing their group project that, for fifth grade, for school, but we are actively involved in sharing those things. And about 20 bills have already passed banning medical care, banning discussion of gender identity and sexual identity in schools, banning Calvin and books like Calvin. So it's been pretty awful.
And I'll add, to know that there are people out there who are trying to legislate our kids out of existence by blocking healthcare, by blocking even talking about LGBTQ issues. It's sending a message to our kids and to the community that they're not worth it. They're undervalued. They have no value. So trying to erase a part of our country that we live in, it's appalling. It's horrifying.
And ultimately, because it's really hard to legislate adults, although we're seeing that happen with the, abortion bans, essentially these legislators are trying to erase the existence of trans and non-binary and LGBTQ people by targeting kids. And I will say, I just saw in the chat a question about language for non-binary. It's actually one of my favorite words, and it's nibbling. And it has not become common here, but it is very common in the UK. For niece and nephew, instead of niece and nephew, it's nibbling.
Thank you. Yes. Well, and I learned that for anyone who hasn't seen the Dolly Parton series on Netflix, I learned the word nibbling from one of those stories, which was a beautiful. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that one either. So I actually did know the answer to that question. There's a few other questions in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. I want to ask just a follow-up question, which is one of the questions in the chat. So something that we're seeing here, as you mentioned, like the onslaught of legislation that is trying to erase and criminalize transgender identities across our country, or just even erase LGBTQ plus identities. I live in Florida, and I'm still like, I'm not moving, but I'm still like, what do I do in this state? And how do I play a role, and what does that look like, and how does it affect people I love? And so those questions are certainly emerging for me and for so many individuals. The one thing that we've seen, and particularly in recent years, although I think this has been a reality for a number of years, is that the reality of capitalism and the involvement of corporate America is one of the ways that change happens. And so there's a more specific question for the two of you of how did your employers support or not support? How did this play out for you in your professional lives as you stepped into this landscape of we're going to be advocates for this conversation? And then I'm curious to see what you're seeing happen in other corporate environments as this legislation is sweeping the nation.
Yeah. So JR worked for the federal government until recently for almost 20 years. And so how was that for you? Yeah. I know that they supported some of our work, but you did have to at times.
Yeah, I would say that they evolved. I was able to actually share our story with several key leaders, when we were back down in DC. I would say over the course of the last probably 5 or 8 years, the federal government kind of as a whole has been more accepting.
Minus these 4 years that were in there.
Yeah, minus those.
I don't know what 4 years you're talking about.
We won't talk about those years.
Yeah.
But in my federal career, I did see that key leaders were open to people being themselves and bringing themselves to work. And it's not widespread, but it starts really local. As with anything, it starts within small groups. And so when we moved up to Massachusetts, I was still kind of called upon to go back down to DC. I actually flew back down to DC to go and share our story for Pride Month back in 2018, I believe. So that wouldn't have been possible, if we didn't have people advocating within the federal government for equal opportunities for us to share our stories. Coming from federal government, public service into the private sector now, where, I feel a lot more comfortable with being who I am as a Black man, as not a person who is normally I'm normally a person who is usually the only one. We talk about the only one. I'm the only Black person in the meeting, or I'm the only person of color. I'm usually not able to share my entire self. So over the course of the last few months, I've been able to share our story. As an interracial couple, as a parent of a trans kid, as a Black man, all these different intersections I've been able to kind of flourish in my current position. And I know that Vanessa, your organization has also been, an ally, for our support as well.
Yeah, I was a teacher when Ellie transitioned. And so Ellie actually kind of transitioned in front of lots of kids and lots of families. And it just became kind of a community experience. But I now work in ed tech in higher education. And my company sent out, unfortunately, I have 1 or 2 folks who are here today, but not the whole company, but they're sending out the recording. They sent out that this was happening. They made time. It's on my calendar, visible to all senior leadership. So they know that we wrote Calvin. They know that we do this advocacy work, and they're supporting making it happen. My company is only about 100 or so at this point. So we're just starting the ERG work, but being involved in that has been really active as well. And also just what I see is, companies need to step away from just looking at this issue in June and knowing that companies, higher education, organizations, that we have LGBTQ people in every facet of your company, your organization, whether you know it or not. So making sure that policies and practices are there. I use this framework for teachers, but it works for organizations and companies as well. And it's educate, affirm, include, and interrupt. Make sure that everyone's educated on the topic. Make sure your policies, your forms, the use of language is affirming. Include, make sure that voices are included in representation at different levels of your company. And if you notice something is amiss, or if people aren't being included, interrupt. And if it's really hard to do that because you're in a place that has a bill like Florida, get support from local organizations who can help you make that interruption.
I love that. Educate, affirm, include, interrupt. Did I get it right?
Yep.
My memory skills are still intact. I love that.
Good.
And I appreciate that the journey, like, because one thing that I find happens for organizations, so groups of humans, or there's this can be down to an individual human or a couple humans, is we have to go on a journey sometimes of like, let's start to understand, which is the education. And then like, once we understand something, then we can start to say, I respect you, I see you, I affirm who you are. Then you're like, okay, now I know that I can take some steps to like actively include you in the conversation, to include you in conversations where we know that we need your voice and identity. And then when you get confident, then you can also say, now I'm going to actually be an ally, an advocate, an accomplice. I'm going to actually interrupt when I see something happening that is not respectful or that could be harmful. Like, how do you sort of step into that? But it's a journey. Like, we don't start all the way and ready to interrupt. We got to go on that journey.
Yeah, and that journey can be really led by leaders. Right? It's sometimes important for leaders of companies to say, maybe like you were saying earlier, Brian, that people may not understand, but they have to take that journey if they want to provide an equitable environment for employees and for those that we serve.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and as you were talking, something else that came to mind that it sort of triggered for me in the question around some of the labels and language we use, and my starting point of understanding gender outside of the binary that I was comfortable with, and understanding sexual orientation outside of the binary that I was comfortable with is not maybe the right word. It was just sort of, I understood. So then it was like this new sort of aha. We shared the gender unicorn resource. Are you familiar with that resource? Yeah, it's a great resource to understand the constructs of gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation through a spectrum versus a specific binary construct. And you've been on that journey with Ellie as they've been sort of figuring out, where do they fit on that spectrum?
Exactly. And we also like to remind everyone whenever we talk that everyone has a gender identity. So when schools are saying like, we can't talk about gender identity with kindergartners, then they can't line up boys in lines and girls in lines. They can't talk about gender, period. That everybody has a gender identity. Everyone on this call has a gender identity, whether you've thought about it or not. Trans people and non-binary folks are often confronted with having to address it because it's incongruent with maybe how they were assigned at birth. Yeah. But I love the gender unicorn. It really shows the intersectionality of all these pieces and kind of the beautiful diversity that can be encapsulated in like a single human.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other questions on language was, we talked about the term for someone who's non-binary, and sort of instead of niece or nephew, it would be nibbling. Is there another term besides son or daughter? What's the term they use to refer to Ellie?
Kiddo.
Yeah.
Kiddo, child. Yeah, got it. Okay.
Our child Ellie, our kiddo Ellie. People will hear the name Ellie and then they'll immediately go to she, and we'll say Ellie uses they them pronouns, and then they say okay. So
we'll correct. We'll
correct. But we always say my child. And with their brother, they have an older brother who's only 17 months older, and he is a great ally and a wonderful little human. He's almost 13, but we will say Ronnie and his sibling. And so it took a while to kind of eradicate that very gendered language from just our everyday conversation, right? It's people want to know. They will say, oh, you have 2 kids, one of each?
Yeah.
And we're like, for 5 years, we're like, yeah, one of each. And now we say, oh, we have a son and we have a transgender non-binary child.
Yeah. And how do people react when you tell them that?
Well, I will say, if it's in a conversation that I think we feel adds value to the conversation or part of the conversation that we're having, then we'll go into that. But if it's just someone who's not really relevant to our sphere, we typically won't entertain that. But for someone who is, of value and importance to us, then we'll go into a conversation about, very, very broad conversation about what that means.
And sometimes like calling the doctor's office. Yes, the doctor at this point, everyone in the office should know, but the office is 30 people. They don't know every single client who walks in.
Yeah.
So I don't go in every time. I say, my child, Ellie, and they say she, and I say, they use they, them pronouns. And that's what I leave it as.
Yeah. I mean, we went to the White House a couple months ago, and
did you just name drop? I think you just named
I know, JR.
I mean, I was at
we were just hanging out at the White House, as we do.
Ellie was with us, and we were going through security, and one of the police officers misgendered them, misidentified them. And at that point, we were going through security, and I was thinking, well, is this a teachable moment, or do we just let this pass? And I talked to Ellie about it after the fact, because they were misidentified right there. So, it's those types of moments where we really have to gauge, is it worth us to talk about it, or is it something that we'll have to kind of bottle up, unfortunately, and talk about after the fact, which I did. I talked to Ellie about it and said, I just want to let you know that through our visit, you may get misgendered because people don't think visually,
right?
Don't know
that you use they, them pronouns. Yeah. So Ellie wears a pin that says they, them on it. And the White House, I will give JR kudos for this. JR was invited with Ellie and about 10 folks to meet with Vice President Kamala Harris on Transgender Day of Visibility, and had a really amazing visit. When we lived in DC, we met with Secretary DeVos to try to convince her to put out a statement in support of trans kids. It didn't work.
This is when they pulled back the Title IX guidance.
Yep. And, I think we've been really lucky to be in these spaces, and Ellie feels generally affirmed. But if people say, wait, what do you mean? We will say, those are the pronouns they use. And then again, decide like which, the dichotomous key of advocacy.
Yeah.
When do we say what? And JD, I love that you said, how do we navigate sense of agency, when to speak up and correct someone, and them being able to speak up themselves? I think we're figuring that out now, right? Ellie is 11. In many spaces, we've had to advocate behind the scenes at school, behind the scenes at the doctor. But Ellie had a very vocal voice, because they're in school 6.5 hours a day, and they have spoken up. They've brought in Calvin. They used to bring in other books. They would explain to their class their identity, and we've supported that. They haven't wanted to do national advocacy like we have, but are okay with us doing it. And obviously, I'll just throw this out there. We started this advocacy work when Ellie was very little. And so ultimately, we gave consent for images and stories. Ellie has never done an interview themselves. And we would often ask, will this article, documentary, conversation, webinar, will they look back on this when they Google themselves and find it and see that it was for good and that it moved the conversation and equality forward? And if we weren't able to say yes to that, we didn't do the event. And I would say there's only one, maybe two things that we've done that have been, we've looked back and be like, that didn't go as planned. Like that was not what we were really thinking. But we actually, every year, they don't remember being 4 or 5 now. So they don't remember some of these experiences, and we've sat with them and we've Googled their names and watched the videos and the different things. And they've been really proud. Their eyes welled up, and they are kind of like, wow, you did this for me and for us. And it's, are we making the best decisions all the time? No. Does any parent? We try, but we definitely try to instill in Ellie language. So sometimes Ellie will let misgendering slide, because they're also figuring out how they present to the world right now. So sometimes they'll present and people will say, oh, you're feminine. Sometimes they'll be more masculine, still trying to figure out how they want to present to the world. And because of that, they can get misgendered as male or sometimes. And they will say like, no, I use they, them pronouns. I'm transgender. And move on.
That question, I think for those of us, whether it's from our own lived experience or because that we've decided to be agents of change or some combination of both, of when is it time to spend the energy and to give of myself, or when is the time to say I'm just going to accept and move on, whatever that acceptance looks like. It's an everyday decision, I think, for us to as part of this conversation. I really appreciate how you sharing around how you have engaged as parents with Ellie about the role that you've chosen to play and whether they want to be part of this or not, and how that plays out and how you're making those decisions. Because I think that's similar to what you were saying earlier, which is another lens on the conversation around this. Are parents forcing kids to be different identities and those sorts of things, which I don't believe is happening. This is a different part of that question, right? Of like, what is the role that the choice you're making versus the choice that your child is making, and how do you have that conversation?
And there are many choices that we make as parents and as advocates, but Ellie's identity was never a choice. It's just who they are. Right. And they're figuring that out. And I think the more that folks can understand that these identities are who people are, that these are not choices, will continue to move things forward for sure. And I see Catherine noting, having to perpetually justify and explain existence is exhausting. And so as parents, a lot of the work that we do is behind the scenes still, so that Ellie doesn't have to do that. So we sent Ellie to middle school, starts in 5th grade in our town, and we're just outside of Boston. And, we met with the principal and we met with the teachers and we explained these are their pronouns and this is their story. And this is what we expect out of this school that's saying that it's affirming to everybody. So that when Ellie went in, the teacher said, I've never used they, them pronouns singularly. Ellie's had an amazing experience. They haven't been misgendered. Every email that we get from the school uses they, them pronouns. And I think that removes some of that energy so Ellie can be 11. We're not going to be there forever. Ellie's going to go into higher education of some kind, a trade. They're an artist, right? Or a traditional college experience, and they will have to advocate in that space. But I just encourage folks from a parent perspective and from a company perspective, trying to take as much of the weight of having to justify existence off of people as possible.
We have 8 minutes left, and I'm like, I still have so many questions. And something that came to mind for me was something that my sister and I learned from our parents, and this wasn't about our identity or lived experience, but there would be things that they learned about, like, that happened in school that they didn't feel was like that's not okay. I need to address that. And what I was really grateful for our parents and how they chose to handle it was they would go have those conversations, and they didn't tell us that they had those conversations. They didn't want to create little monsters who are like, mom and dad are going to go fix it. They told us years later that we had those conversations and we were part of that journey because we wanted you to have the best experience you could have, but they also wanted us to be responsible little humans. And so that's, I'm hearing that as well, of like that balancing act of how do you navigate that?
I think parenting is one big, how do you navigate that? I feel like that should be a parenting book, and then it's just blank because nobody has the answer.
I love that. Well, I want to ask a couple questions just for you, JR, and certainly, Vanessa, you may have some thoughts here. But one thing that when we think about the intersectionality conversations, the various lived experiences, you're a father, and in this conversation, and I know that so many times in our country with the expectations we have of men, that there are a lot of fathers who are like, I don't understand my role in this, and don't know if I can be in this conversation. And you are clearly leaning into this conversation. How has that been for you as a man who grew up in this country, and so subject to all of the messages that I was and other men are subject to as well?
Do you have another half an hour?
So I was like, I'm going to ask this question, realizing it's sort of unfair in 8 minutes.
This is therapy. No, but I certainly had to navigate my own journey as a man, as a Black man, as a pair in an interracial couple, as a supportive parent to a trans kid. So I had a lot of things to unpack. But the thing that I kind of go back to is having the awareness that I have all these intersectionalities. I'm an introvert. I internalize. As traditional men do, we internalize a lot of our emotions and feelings. And so seeking out mental health services, finding a therapist was a part of my own journey, even outside of Ellie. To unpack why am I the way that I am, as an adult. So a lot of that was done through therapy, and I still go to therapy to continue that conversation, and understanding of myself, about toxic masculinity that we kind of are, that's in the in the main conversation today that we talk about and think about. A lot of it comes from being afraid of change, to something that you have grown up in, or you've just been, socialized, about, and it's not divorced from other problems that we have in this country, about racism, about bigotry, about xenophobia. All these different things are kind of founded in what we call these traditional and conventional values in this country. And guess what? It's all bullshit,
Did we say that word of hummingbird hour? I don't know if we can.
I know, it's all sorry.
Whether.
And JR does not curse. That just
curse.
took me by a lot of surprise. I think the events recently and everything is bringing it up.
Well, you look at all these different obstacles that people have that they arm themselves with, whether it's their values, whether it's religion, whether it's having all these different obstacles that people put up because they're afraid of change. Something that's different that they haven't learned about, that they haven't seen before. And those were some of the obstacles that I had. But again, it goes back to the awareness and the acknowledgement and the action that I took for myself to become a much more caring and empathetic human being. So a lot of people are afraid to do that. A lot of men are afraid to do that and avail themselves, to their family, to their loved ones. And so it takes a lot of work, but, again, you have to take the action in order to create the change and to bring people into your world who you love and support. And so for me, all those intersections, it's exhausting, but, you have to continue the work. And, it's something that I continue to this day.
I will also say that one of the pushback we got kind of from trolls on the internet was like, oh, this liberal white mom is forcing this on her child, and this poor dad and this Black dad couldn't possibly support. It became this whole racialized conversation, when in fact I struggled more in the beginning than JR. JR and Ellie are like this. JR tucks Ellie into bed every night. It's dad, 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 dad all the time, and always has been from the beginning.
We're not supposed to have favorites, but it happens, right? So
I know. I'm working on moving up the ranks.
I call it having your favorite people.
Favorite people.
Yeah.
Favorite people. Absolutely. Well, and favorite people change over the course of time. And you know
absolutely.
What? I mean, as parents, what's most important, I'm sure, is that your child has someone that they love and that they're loved. And however that works out is beautiful.
Yes.
Well, I know that, again, I would love to keep going. So I know Mark is going to add into the chat how people could connect with you two and how they can get the book Calvin. But, just for anyone who is watching or listening, how do they find you on the interwebs, and how do they buy the book Calvin?
All right. So Calvin's available wherever books are sold. So online or locally.
Go to your local bookstore and ask for it.
Yeah, go to your local bookstore, library, ask for it. It's coming out in French in Canada, in Swedish and in German in those countries as well, which is kind of exciting. You can go to jrandvanessaford.com, which is our website, and contact us. And we're also the Ford family on Facebook, where we try to share advocacy, not just elevating our own voice, but the voices of others, which is really, really important to us.
I love that. I love that. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm so glad that we know each other now, and I look forward to future conversations and collaborations. As we wrap up, I would love just to invite you both to say any just final words or messages you'd like to leave everyone with.
Love and just be yourself. Support, any way you can.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to people are who they say they are until they tell you otherwise, and just do the work yourself, and you're not alone. There are communities of people, organizations working to make the world a better place for trans and non-binary people. Let your voice be heard, and don't wait for a conversation. Start one if you need to. And we're always available to chat.
I love that. I love that. I want to share with you what one of our guest said in the chat. What an inspiring and authentic couple, which I couldn't agree more. I'm so glad that we get to know you both. And thank you all for being with us today. This has really been such a magical and beautiful conversation, and you are both truly an inspiration, Vanessa and JR. I look forward to following you and learning more from you. For all of you that have joined us today, please come back next month when we're here with Rhodes Perry. Actually, next week when we're here with our trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming community colleagues, and then next month with Rhodes Perry. So until then, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.